afternoon to all. And do we not want again to say, to give cognizance to, I am not afraid of the gospel. Yes. This is, as it was said, the introduction to Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow. America is still not an egalitarian democracy. The arguments and rationalizations that have been trotted out in support of racial exclusion and discrimination in its various forms have changed and evolved, but the outcome has remained the same. An extraordinary percentage of black men in the United States are legally barred from voting today, just as they have been throughout most of American history. They are also subject to legalized discrimination in employment, in housing, in education, in public service, and in jury service, just as their parents and grandparents and great-grandparents were. What has changed since the collapse of the Jim Crow has less to do with the basic structure of our society than with the language we use to justify it. In the era of color blindness, it is no longer socially acceptable or permissible to use race explicitly as a justification for discrimination, exclusion, and service contempt. It's no longer acceptable, so we don't do it. Rather than rely on race, we use our criminal justice system to label people of color, quote, criminals, unquote, and then engage in all the practices supposedly left behind. Today, it is perfectly legal to discriminate against criminals in nearly all of the ways that it was once legal to discriminate against African Americans. Once you're labeled a felon, the old forms of discrimination, employment discrimination, housing discrimination, denial of the right to vote, denial of educational opportunity, denial of food stamps, and the other public benefits, and exclusion from jury service, are suddenly legal. As a criminal, you have scarcely more rights and arguably less respect. You have less respect than a black man living in Alabama at the height of Jim Crow. We have not ended racial caste system in America. We have merely redesigned it. 10 years ago, I would have argued strenuously against the central claims made here in this position, namely that something akin to racial caste system currently exists in the United States. Quite belatedly, I came to see that mass incarceration in the United States had in fact emerged as a stunningly comprehensive and well-disguised system of radicalized and racialized social control, and that it functions in a manner strikingly similar to Jim Crow. I understood the problem plaguing poor communities of color, including problems associated with crime and rising incarceration rates. I thought them to be a function of poverty and a lack of access to quality education, and to the continuing legacy of slavery and Jim Crow. Never did I seriously consider the possibilities that a new racial caste system was operating in this country. The new system had been developed and implemented swiftly, and it was largely invisible. Those of us who sympathize with the plight of the so-called underclass tend to interpret the experience of those caught up in the criminal justice system primarily through the lens of popularized social science, attributing the staggering increase in incarceration rates in communities of color to the predictable, though unfortunate, consequence of poverty, racial segregation, unequal educational opportunities, and the presumed realities of the drug market, including the mistaken belief that most drug dealers are black or brown. The impact of the drug war has been astounding. In less than 30 years, the U.S. penal system has exploded from around 300,000 to more than 2 million. 2 million. With drug convictions accounting for the majority of the instances. The United States now has the highest rate of incarceration in the world. It dwarfs the rates of nearly every developed country, even surpassing those in highly repressive regimes like Russia, China, and Iran. The racial dimension of mass incarceration is its most striking feature. No other country in the world imprisons so many of its racial or its ethnic minorities. The United States imprisons a larger percentage of its black population than South Africa did at the height of apartheid. Studies show that people of all colors use and sell illegal drugs, and they do it at a remarkably similar rate. They frequently suggest that whites, particularly white youth, are more likely to engage in drug crime than people of color or white loose. That is not what one would guess, however, entering our nation's prisons. The prisons which are overflowing with black and brown drug offenders. In some states, black men have been admitted to prison on drug charges at rates 20 to 50 times greater than those of white men. 20 to 50 times greater than those of white men. And in a majority of cities racked by the drug war, as many as 80% of young African American men have now criminal records and are the subject to legalized discrimination for the rest of their lives. These young men are part of a growing underclass, permanently locked up and out of mainstream society. It might be surprising to some that drug crime was declining, not rising, when the war on drugs was fostered. These days, activists who advocate a world without prisons are often dismissed as quacks. But only a few decades ago, the notion that our society would be much better off without prisons and that the end of prisons was more or less inevitable, not only dominated mainstream academic thinking in the field of criminology, but also inspired a national campaign by reformers demanding a moratorium on the building of prisons. Far from fading away, it appears that prisons are here to stay. And despite the unprecedented levels of incarceration in the African American community, the civil rights community is oddly quiet. Yet mass incarceration tends to be categorized as a criminal justice issue, as opposed to a racial justice issue or a civil rights issue. Mass incarceration is metaphorically the new Jim Crow, and all those who care about social justice should fully commit themselves to dismantling this new racial caste. This is the most damaging manifestation of the backlash against the civil rights movement. The popular narrative that emphasizes the death of slavery and Jim Crow celebrates the nation's triumph over race with the election of Barack Obama. This is dangerously misguided. The colorblind public consensus that prevails in America today, that the widespread belief that race no longer matters, has blinded us to the realities of race in our society and facilitated the emergence of a new race caste. Like Jim Crow and slavery, mass incarceration operates at a frightfully networked system of laws, of policies, of customs and institutions that operate collectively to ensure the subordinate status of a group defined largely by race. No task is more urgent for racial justice advocates today than ensuring that America's current racial caste system is its last. We shall not be. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cecilia.